Welcome everybody with this evening Schools Out number 14. My name is Michelle Provost and I'm here with my colleague Wouter van Stiphout. This evening will be, well, of course it's already different than it used to be with, there's no audience, and also we have to end the evening at 8 o'clock straight because of the curfew, and Wouter has to go home before he gets picked up by the police.
Yes.
So I'm very happy that we have another honored guest tonight. As you know, the Schools Out evenings are always with one guest that we find inspiring and that we want to share with you. And this time it's Kilian Kleinschmidt, who's with us on Zoom. Why did we invite him? It's exactly 3 years ago now that we, with Crimson, were finishing off a project that was called A City of Comings and Goings. It was going to be shown on the Venice Biennale, and it was also a publication. Its topic was migration, and we took a historical perspective to show that actually migration has been with us, with our urban societies, for as long as humankind, and that it's a permanent phenomenon that we might as well accept and cater for. So this was also a publication that showed all the influences of migration on our cities, for instance in this panorama made by Hugo Corbett. And it was also about how can we accommodate our cities better to migration and to people who move to our cities and also move out of it again. 2018-19 was also the time of huge debates about around this topic. And during one of those debates, I met Kilian Kleinschmidt, who was also in the news with a statement at that time that the refugee camps like Za'atari, where he was the mayor at that time, that they are actually new cities, that they are also permanent, and that the average refugee lives in a camp like that for almost 70 years. So there was some kind of parallel thinking there. So for that reason, we decided to invite him. Let me tell something shortly about his background. And let me first check if he's still there.
I'm here, I'm here.
You're here. Okay, so Kilian has, I think, almost 30 years of hands-on experience in international development, emergency response, and regional cooperation in a wide range of organizations, mainly UNHCR. He worked in a lot of countries. You can basically trace the range of disasters that we have had for the last 25 years, and he has been at these places. He has been the humanitarian coordinator for Somalia. He is the deputy, has been the deputy representative for UNHCR in Kenya, and deputy to the special envoy of the UN Secretary General for Assistance to Pakistan. Right now, well, we'll talk about what you are doing right now later. Based in Tunisia, last year in Greece, so you move around quite a lot. And you are also the initiator of IPA Switchboard, which stands for Innovation and Planning Agency. And I hope that we'll also talk about that a little bit more later. But first, I would like to give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle and Wouter, to give me this opportunity to speak to you and through you also to many other people watching us tonight. Let me speak about my sort of change perspective of the issue of people on the move, on displacement, forced displacement, but also happy displacement, or in a way, happy migration. I'm a happy migrant. I live in Tunis, it's my choice. I've established my company here now as well. And no, for those who are asking, there's no revolution ongoing. There are problems and big issues because of COVID-19, because of still a struggle with the consequences of the revolution and how to move forward. But yeah, let me speak about where this is all coming from. When I was 18, and I grew up in Berlin, the wild years of the 70s, discovering basically parallel systems, parallel societies in a way, squatting houses, etc. I decided to settle in France. And that was sort of my dropout moment. I finished school, secondary school, and then decided to settle in France. And that was quite an experience. I settled in the Pyrenees, high up in the mountains at 1,000 meters altitude. And that was a place which was largely abandoned by young people. It was average age 60 years or something. People were still plowing the fields with oxen. There was many houses who still didn't have a central heating. People were living with the cows and so on. I mean, it was really backwards, as you would say. It was a development scenario in a way. And there's young people from mostly France and some of us from other parts of Europe deciding to move into that area. And because it was romantic, it was beautiful. I mean, after this sort of urban life, that was what appeared to me and many of my friends as sort of the future. And somehow that experience was very tough in the beginning. I mean, first of all, you change your lifestyle because, I mean, you don't have the same facilities, you don't have a cinema, you don't have any sort of real cultural activities, your facilities are poor, you're living in houses with very basic standards. But the main issue was that the people, the local people, the old people, looked at us as the hippies, the newcomers, those strangers who were basically disturbing the environment. And so, I mean, it went very far. I mean, they were really basically sabotaging our efforts to do things. But then I became a roofer. And so we set up a cooperative, which then grouped some 20 artisans of mostly young people who had decided to settle there. And we became service providers. We became essential in actually reviving the area. We were quite successful and we made money with that, and we reinvested the money in further jobs. We helped young people who wanted to settle to first get an employment and so on and so forth. And yes, we were service providers to the local people, and they were quite dependent on us providing, repairing their houses, their roofs, electricians, we had carpenters, we had masons, everything else. It took about 20 years or so that, in fact, we grew together. And now one of those who came basically in the same time as me, who came on a motorbike with long hair and a leather jacket, he's the mayor of the main village. And I still have my house in the side, a little part of the village where there used to be 3 inhabited houses. Now it's 15. And so through, I mean, that local integration in a way, it took 20 years. Now, it was in 1980, now 40 years later, I think this is a success story. There's internet, there's sustainable tourism, there are activities, people work, of course, also from home, and the land is being worked again, and the average age has really dramatically sort of reduced. So it's for me and it has been this experience, first of all, being in a collective, in a cooperative, and then basically contributing to local development, if you can say, and revitalization of a region has been driving a lot of my work later on. So that's my own experience as a migrant, being despised, being sort of rejected, being felt as an intruder and as a as a danger in a way for the local life in the beginning, and now being seen as, well, having contributed to development. When I left in 1988, I decided to learn how to ride a motorbike, and I went to Mali, across the desert. That was still possible at the time. There was no jihad going on, there was no fighting going on, it was possible. I ended up building a school in northern Mali as a volunteer. It wasn't planned, it just happened. And then from there, sort of by coincidence, suddenly finding myself a couple of years later in southern Sudan. And in southern Sudan, I was working with the United Nations World Food Programme as a food monitor, distributing food aid. I was witness to massacres, to war, to displacement en masse, 200,000 people displaced, thousands of people killed. And at some point, I had to flee myself, together with 20,000 Sudanese, the so-called lost boys of southern Sudan, crossing the border from South, well, at the time still Sudan, and that was in 1992, crossing from southern Sudan to Kenya, and suddenly these 20,000 people became refugees. And I became a UNHCR staff. I was the first field officer setting up part of the initial team, setting up Kakuma refugee camp, which still exists today. Mind you, that was 1991. We came with 20,000, mostly young Sudanese. Now there are 200,000 people living in Kakuma. When I set up the camp, there were a few local families on the land which had been designated, which had been found to be suitable, more or less suitable for a camp, for housing and storing a number of people. And there were only few local families. We bribed them to leave the land and move somewhere else. They were semi-nomadic. It was not a big problem for them. They were happy about what we gave them. Now, in Kakuma, in the whole series of camps, there's 60,000 local people living off the camp, basically. 200,000 refugees from many countries all over Africa, and 60,000 local people having found jobs, many of them being employed by successful refugee business people, providing services, and at the same time having opportunities through a number of jobs which have been created. And then immediately after that, I was sent to the Somali border, where there was in the same time in '92 this massive influx of Somalis after the civil war broke out in Somalia. And the whole chain of camps was set up. And the most famous, still existing, again, Dadaab, which has housed at times up to 350,000 people or so in a number of sub-camps, was established. I had at the time to set up a camp a bit further north, called Kakuma, which doesn't exist anymore. So some camps go and, are built and then they go, and some others they stay. So why I'm telling this story? Because that was '92. So back in 2011, I had just left Pakistan. I'm sent back to Kenya, then as deputy representative in charge of program in Kenya for UNHCR again. And these two camps, which I had seen established, they were still there. They were still there, and I realized, well, something was going wrong because the type of assistance we were providing was still the same. My son, who wanted at the time to become a water engineer a bit later, he was going to Kakuma camp, and he came back shocked because he discovered that the water systems were basically still the same water systems set up by NGOs in the early '90s. And and he did that in 2012. But it was still the same water system, but every 2 years or 3 years, you have to change the pipes and the bladder tanks and so on. Nothing had really been transformed to become something more sustainable. So here you're having two camps, which basically are in existence for 30 years, and I mean, in 2011, nobody looked at them with a different eye. So I started in 2011 to look at the Dadaab camp initially. I called it the City of Dadabia project. I said, well, there are 300,000 people living. They're living in the middle of a very poor area of Kenya. The sort of average humanitarian aid going into that place per year was, at the time there was a new famine going on, at least 200 million, if not 250 million dollars going into this place, into one of the poorest regions. Yet there was absolutely no connection, no connectivity between the vision, let's say, of the Kenyan government, the World Bank, and others who looked at the northeastern Kenya or northwestern Kenya, where Kakuma is. They looked at this and, my God, what do we do? How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with poverty? How do we deal with eventually also criminality and insurgency and these things? Forgetting that they had two major drivers of economy sitting in the middle of it. So there was a total disconnect. So the humanitarians looking at the Dadaab or Kakuma camps and maybe 50 kilometers around and doing little things for the local people, because that's nice to do. When you have a bit of more money, you do something for the local people. But they were still doing exactly the same year after year after year, depending on donor contribution, which make these places survive. So I said, this can't be. So we need to really look at that from a different angle. And then again, well, after a number of other assignments and so on, and particularly again also Mogadishu, where I had been already in 1993 during the unfortunate period of the Battle of Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down. I was there that day and so on. But I was sent back to Mogadishu as Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia, in charge of Mogadishu City, coordinating humanitarian effort, finding myself with 350,000 displaced people, internally displaced people living throughout the city. And again, there was very little being done which would resemble anything sustainable. We were trying to get some aid to people. Of course, there was still issues in 2000, that was in 2012 when I was there. There were still issues of militia and insecurity, but the most important point was the attitude of ourselves, the narrative we had. These people will go back. And here we're coming to some very important points. I mean, 350,000 people in Mogadishu, internally displaced, 250, 300,000 or so in Dadaab, there for decades. 200,000 people from different countries in Kakuma, there for decades. And we're still talking about return. So we're holding basically, and this was my conclusion, we're not moving forward somewhat. We don't allow people to move forward. We force them to look backwards. Discovering that as well, something has happened to the people, which is very human. The moment you touch a different environment, that you begin to be taken out or by force, and unfortunately quite often, out of your normal environment, you encounter something new. That's already where your transformation starts. And it's not forcibly bad. I mean, I'm not saying that displacement is good, but it also contributes to maybe new visions and a new perspective. So somebody who is now living in one of the sub-camps of Dadaab, which usually has a size of about 100,000 people or so, that's an urban place. You have urbanized. There's activities ongoing. There's a market street. In all the camps, there's market streets. There's internet. There's 4G in many of these places. I mean, it's connected. You're having life. You're encountering different people, which you wouldn't have back in your village, in your place. So many people don't feel at all like going back to where they were. Of course, there's emotions. There's lost rights. We will not, of course, despise that. But the most important issue is to recognize that people have the right to change. So I discovered nobody is really asking them. I mean, there's maybe intention surveys and things like that. Would you like to return? And then many people will respond, yes, of course, we're dreaming about return. But in fact, no, they will not return to the place of origin, which is in fact the mantra we're all having in mind when we're talking, when we hear even the word refugee or displaced person. That's what we have in mind. Oh, these people must be dreaming about return. And that's what I call the myth of return. And there has been work done on that, on, yes, the emotions, of course, the lost rights, the obligation to recognize the rights of people who have been displaced, no doubt. But there has been very little also done on that sort of real transformation which is taking place. We have we have a number of very good examples, apart from ourselves. I mean, you sitting in Rotterdam, me sitting in Tunis. Why do we exist? Because our ancestors never returned. There has been big movements, migrations, forced migration over the history of mankind, of human beings, and people usually couldn't or wouldn't return. But some very concrete examples. I was myself involved in the repatriation, which was a little bit, let's say, induced by the environment in Pakistan to Afghanistan. So while I spent 5 years in Pakistan, close to 1 million people or so returned to Afghanistan. Now, UNHCR, the humanitarians, we all worked inside of Afghanistan on the returns to the places where they had been displaced 30, 40 years ago. Land allocation schemes, little huts and chickens and goats and stuff. And then suddenly everybody discovered that they wouldn't stay there. They would go, in fact, to the cities. And if you look into the urban growth in Afghanistan, I mean, the cities have grown exponentially, like we're experiencing throughout the world, urbanization, which is taking place. Because people in exile had learned to live in big camps, or once assistance had been reduced, they had been moving out and living in the Pakistani cities. And of course, they wouldn't like to go back to a life without all these amenities and facilities. So this brings me really to this sort of statement that we need to absolutely review that reflex we are having, and we have to look deep in ourselves. We all have this reflex. When we hear refugee, we think about the tent, we think about return, we think about humanitarian aid, and so on. And in fact, it blocks everybody. It really blocks us. And yes, you have mentioned the camp of Za'atari, which was the last assignment I had directly with the United Nations. I decided to quit afterwards because I didn't feel anymore that there was enough space for new ideas, to be honest. So I decided to quit and then move on my own and challenge the system. But maybe a couple of words on Za'atari camp. I found was sent to Za'atari because it was in turmoil. It was a camp established in 2012, 10 kilometers from the Syrian border. On request by the Jordanian government, UNHCR set up the camp, which had grown to roughly 100,000 people very fast. There were about 2,000 people coming in, 1,000 to 2,000 people coming from Syria every night. Many, however, still escaped from the camp and stayed and moved to the Jordanian villages and cities. Also the camp obsession, which I observe with many people who contact me, they say, oh, what can we do in the camps? Again, keep in mind that only very few people live in camps. Most people move and are displaced in cities, the so-called urban displaced or urban refugees. That's the rule rather than the exception. Camps are the exception. And so in Jordan, 650,000 people or so registered as refugees and 120,000 are in camps. So again, Za'atari was one of these examples where, well, a portion stays in the camp, full assistance provided, all humanitarian sphere standards, as we call them, satisfied. I mean, enough water, enough food, shelter, basic shelter provided, health services, schools, you name it. But people were unhappy, very unhappy, and they kept on beating up the humanitarians, fighting with the Jordanian police. Why? Because there was a totally different conception between what they saw as being a piece of Syria, which was a bit doubtful statement. They said, how can something be Jordan if there's 100,000 Syrians? But the main argument was in saying, well, you force us basically here to accept your food, the water, you decide everything. And basically the difference between us seeing 100,000 people being stored, being put into a warehouse. Yes, we, the humanitarians, happy about the success story of being, for once, being able to provide the basics. But there was no real concept of looking at what would happen with these people if they have to stay for 20, 30 or years or forever. And the people themselves wouldn't accept that concept of storage. So it drove our site planners into nervous breakdowns when tents were moved and what they call caravans or containers were moved within seconds from the exact location you had put them down. People put them together, they put them into houses, they put them into what they considered being themselves. And that's also, again, one of these myths around refugees, about displacement, about migrants, talking about community. I mean, as long as you yourself, you feel unsafe, you will not be able to think about community. And living in a tent which you can't lock, which doesn't reflect any individuality, which doesn't reflect your personality, or even a container which is all standard and is equipped with the same things. You eat the same, you drink the same, you live in the same gray or white container or tent. It doesn't give you the personality and the dignity you require to be able to give back to community. So the first very, very important aspect in this is to recognize there's 100,000 individuals. It's not a community. They don't like to go to communal toilet and have then a community toilet cleaning committee which cleans the toilet. No, they want to have theirs. So what happened? 90 buildings were looted. We had built actually with bricks and blocks. We had built toilets and communal showers and communal kitchens. The materials were used to build 14,000 individual toilets and kitchens. And that's only then, once they were able to basically go to the loo alone, to cook alone, within the family, of course, and lock the door, then we could speak about community. And suddenly, surprise, surprise, violence was reduced. It took us 1 year of reducing basically daily battles. There was a police officer killed, there were injured people. I had injured colleagues in Za'atari. Was there from 2013 to 14. We had one distribution. I remember 6 people injured ending up in hospital, 4 destroyed cars. All that vanished, disappeared within 1 year because we engaged, we talked, we established a personal relationship. They knew that my name was Kilian and not Mr. Camp Manager or Mr. Mayor, which became my nickname. And here again, that's when we started. And I remember the encounter with Minister Ploemen from the Dutch minister. When she came, she said, Kilian, what do you need? I said, I need city planners. I need something different here. I mean, I have community, this, I have health workers, I have site planners, I have water engineers, but I have nobody who knows how to run a city. So she went back, and then with VNG and the city of Amsterdam, we set up a program, we developed a program where that support, which we urgently need, provided. Looking at Za'atari camp as a city. It was very interesting also for, I think, particularly for the team from Amsterdam to see the challenge. I mean, between the grid planning, the urban, the camp planning versus a sustainable grid planning you would do in the cities. So they looked, for instance, also to compare at Palestinian settlements, which had been camps. I had seen these camps in the 70s as a tourist. I remember tents. And these tents had grown into little houses, and the little houses had become to multi-stories. But still, the design and the grid was linked on camps, which makes that parts of Amman or other places in the Middle East where Palestinians live are unsustainable from an urban planning perspective. So it was a missed opportunity at an early stage to basically change the gear, move over to an urban planning gear, and as well look into how would you provide services. And there was a very interesting observation from the WaterNet people from Amsterdam, looking at the planned water system for the camp, which was done by the humanitarians, the planning. And they thought they could do that much more efficiently and also cheaper in using their abilities of urban water management. We had also people from the city of Marseille coming into and looking at this and said, well, what are you doing? This is not sustainable. So from there, and that was, I think, once I had left the camp, so I had sort of with other people started to conceptualize the ideas around how would refugee camps be managed better, infrastructure and services be structured better, and we came to the concept of refugee cities. How do you transform camps? So we created actually an organization called Refugee Cities in the United States. But then moving away, let's say, from the refugee world, where I discovered as well, looking at it from the other places where I started working as a consultant or in my own projects, well, the actual pure refugee dimension is pretty small. I mean, yes, we have more refugees since the Second World War. I mean, that's what you hear, and UNHCR is right to point out to that. There's more people as refugees registered than for a few decades now. But there's also other people on the move. We have climate change. We have different forms of movements. And maybe here a quick example from Bangladesh. You have 1 million people from Myanmar, the Rohingya, and everybody gets excited over 1 million people being now in camps. And of course, I mean, there's big issues around that, how sustainable the camps are. Now there's a relocation program to an island. I mean, we can discuss all that. But put that into perspective. There's at least 20 million people in Bangladesh who have to move away from the coastal areas because of climate change, because of rising seawater levels. So, I mean, if I would be the government of Bangladesh, for me, that 1 million people is not my real issue. My issue is that I have an overcrowded capital city, Dhaka, and I don't know how to deal with that city anymore. Informal settlements growing. It's one of the highest population densities in the world, and so on. And so what do? Looking into that dimension of other movements, where you can easily say there's over 1 billion people on the move for a number of reasons. There's billions living in informal, unsafe settlements without proper services, etc. So how can we look only at 25 million refugees? And how can we look only at the refugee camps or those living in refugee camps amongst the 25 million refugees? Let's look at this in a broader way. And that's where we said, well, we got it somewhat wrong, yes, with refugee cities. We need to move forward and actually look on concepts which sort of try to find tools and develop a toolkit, in fact, for those who are dealing with that, regarding major influx of, let's say, a mixed population. And I'm actually going in a couple of weeks back to Ethiopia, where we're working on a project of what we call now sustainable development zones, having sort of pick the brains of Paul Romer and his Charter City approach, but saying, well, we need to work on something much more on the lower end, bottom up, creation of sustainable settlements. Yes, as a special zone, why not? Not forever, but maybe starting that as a beginning to set them up in the same way as you would set up a charter city in the concept of Roma or others, but really target those 1 million people who move into an urban center every week somewhere in the world. And despite COVID, that trend will continue for the poor people, or will reverse now that many have moved out. I'm conscious that there is sort of a reverse movement as we speak, but it will also go back to that urbanization, and particularly on the continent where I live, where cities are growing by 1 million people a year. And so is Addis Ababa, where I'm going to, where we're sort of suggesting on Ethiopia, which goes from an urbanization level of currently 21% to about 105 million people to 40% of urbanization within the next 20 years or so, and that of an expected population of 140 million. They have real challenges. And it's a mix between internally displaced people. As we know, there's, of course, conflict going on, different types of conflicts in Ethiopia. There's development going on which displaces people. There's the attraction of a city. So people are moving. And so you will find these ever-growing urban centers, which are negative if nobody deals with this, but could as well be transformed into a positive driver of development. Cities and urban centers don't have to be a negative thing. If they're managed and planned in a proper way, they can actually be a driver for change, for positive change. Keeping in mind, of course, all what we have learned about bad city planning over the last decades. So here I'm saying, let's equip those dealing with this with different options. We're not saying our Sustainable Development Zone model, and please welcome, we have sdzalliance.org as a group, as a website, where we're presenting, and we're presenting our partners and as well the concept. But this is not all. So it needs to be looked into a different perspective. Yes, there's billions of people somewhat in transformation, in change, in need of solutions which are different than what we have right now. And this is urgent. This is really one of the requirements. And we may have discussions, and I have had these discussions on the pros and cons of informality versus formality. But inclusive bottom-up cities, and we are planning them as social enterprises, actually, we think this is one way of dealing with that, so that people are becoming bankable. People get access to, in the system we're having currently, which happens to be a capitalist system driven by bankability, and currently we're seeing too many people being excluded. So I believe that, and we should be coming to the discussion now, looking at the time. I really believe that we have primarily to change our own reflexes. We have primarily to change the narrative around that. Again, return is not the ultimate goal. For me, it is having people access and integrate into whatever systems we have, using their arrival as a driver for improved services and infrastructure, using this as a trigger. That is number one. Yes, for those who are ending up in camps, look at the camps in a different way. Look into those situations where it's very unlikely that people will be going back as you would go back after a bushfire or a flood or something. Most of them would go back. But in most situations, that is not the case. Looking as well at, and that's what I do with IPA Switchboard. We're trying to set up the switchboard, the global switchboard, looking at the globe being a brain, and our future is connectivity, if you want it, if you like it or not. But a child learns to walk, to speak, to act, grows up with all the connectivities it gets in the brain, with all the synapses which are opening. That's how you start walking. And our globe can only survive, and that's the belief of, and that's the philosophy behind what I'm doing now, is through putting people into connection. And I really think that we can solve a lot of problems and have a better flow of the acquis of what we already have invented, of what we have already innovated. There's a solution somewhere in the world. Somebody has a model, somebody has the technology, all the money, all the best practice, all the worst practice, learning by mistake out there. And that should be definitely, I think, our future. And like a brain, let's grow together. Let's connect the demand, the opportunities with the wealth of supply, which for the moment remains, in fact, the luxury of a few in our world. So with this, I think we can have a few minutes of discussion so that Walters doesn't get arrested.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for this talk. There's really like a myriad of topics in there, and a myriad of ways in which it connects to all the discussions that we have about how to integrate migrants in the societies in Europe, how to, well, and I hope we also come to that in a minute. But first I would like to ask you something which I think is intriguing, especially since you started describing yourself as a hippie, starting this goat farm in France, southern France. But now the name of your office is Innovation and Planning Agency, and it seems that you have gone through this whole development, well, which is only natural, I guess, but which is optimist in a way of not being a kind of moral optimism about maybe like migration is something that should be normal, that should be tolerated in our Western world, or no left-wing arguments. It seems rather apolitical to me. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, because what you are proposing is to look at things as to clearly define the problems, if it's housing or water or people living in this one camp for such a long time, and then coming up with technical solutions to this problem. I was wondering, is this a kind of a trick to sort of to go by the political debate and not get stuck in that?
Well, I mean, I believe that we need to depoliticize migration. I mean, it's like climate change. I mean, I think, with the exception of some, I mean, most people have somewhat accepted that there is a challenge on our environment and on our climate. But so, from different angles, from different parties, everybody will have at least, and we can have different views on this, but everybody will have something about climate change reduction or something in their political programs. Migration has been highly politicized. Migration has become a tool to win or lose elections, or make people lose elections. It's manipulated. I mean, I will not go into details, but I've been involved, unfortunately, in some of these attempts to manipulate migration, to block flows, then open the tap so that you can create fear, and you're getting into this narrative. And I mean, that's sort of a big political game which has been going on for a few years. We discovered a plot to sort of unleash fear just before the last European elections. So that is very clearly out there. But it all, again, comes to the sort of, I mean, besides that, I'm more afraid currently, and I've also written a paper on that we will go to a situation of people mining. We will not be digging for gold and coltan and things as much as for people. Despite all the robots and so on. I mean, somebody out there still needs to clean something or so. So this people mining will be at some point replacing this. So we will have, in fact, exploitation and even some form of trafficking, which is our real future threat. So which gangs of recruiting people in other countries and bring them to us. And then, I mean, we know what's going on already in some of our factories, the meat factories and God knows what. I mean, exploitation to the last level. So we need to be wary of that.
But couldn't this also be one of the factors in this depoliticizing effort, like people mining, if there's a real shortage of labor force, for instance, in Western Europe, couldn't that be like an objective argument behind migration?
Yeah, for instance, that's something that we're all trying desperately to open, and I'm part also of the migration working group in Berlin, and so on, trying to open up the, what we call the legal pathways. But I mean, I'm sitting in Tunisia. It still takes an average between the moment that somebody gets a job as a nurse in Germany and the moment that the person actually shows up in Germany. It takes 16 months. I mean, this can't be. This needs to change because there's, of course, now with COVID, visa until you get an appointment, it takes you 4 months, recognition of diploma, this, that. So this needs to be much more fluid. But I really would like to come back to this sort of the narrative as well around the good refugee and the bad migrant is one narrative, which I also think we have to be careful. And I appeal to my former colleagues of UNHCR not to, I mean, people are on the move for a number of reasons. Absence of access to basic human rights. For me, it's a reason to move. If you don't have a job, if you don't have a quality life, that's a reason to move. But okay, we can. But that's one narrative. The other one is really this: people should be. I mean, we should change that storytelling about people are coming to stay, not to go back. And even when Germany, and the famous sentence by Angela Merkel, when he said, "We can do it. You're welcome, dear Syrians," she also said, and that in a number of interviews, to calm down the public. But in fact, I think, with due respect to everything she has been doing, it was a mistake because she said, "You will go back when Syria is a peaceful country." So the message she gave in that time was, well, you are going to be our guests. We will be your hosts. And then in a couple of years, or a few years, you will go back. Instead of, and what does it produce? So the guests, I mean, I wouldn't bother to learn the language. I wouldn't bother to really understand where I have landed. And the hosts, well, there's now people, and that's again being used by right-wing populist arguments. They're going to eat up our pension funds. They're going to eat up this. And they're coming with 10 children, and then and so on. So we need to again, cool down on that and say basically, and we can't enough talk about the Canada model also and saying, okay, you're here, nothing prevents you from going back one day, but you will become a citizen within a certain time. These are the conditions. You learn the language, you do this, you do that. So we have to understand ourselves differently. But again, also please, I think we need to recall, and that's why coming back to our sustainable development zones, I mean, most of the migration has nothing to do with Europe. I mean, the most important migration flows are taking place within regions, are regionalized, are within the African continent, for instance, where many people, I mean, Libya is still a destination country, you believe it or not, but there's 1 million guest workers in Libya. Other countries are destination countries, South Africa, you name it. So the flows are not only to Europe. And that's also something where we need to get the politicians to understand this and this talk about doing more. This is also, by the way, where we all meet somehow in the narrative. The talk about doing more on the root causes or doing more in the countries of origin. Well, talk about regions, talk about regional flows. Don't deny people the right to change. I mean, the sort of this idea, because I'm giving 3 goats to somebody, and maybe there's a water well, he will not move. No, that's not the point. Many people will still move, and that's
Yeah. Yep. Can I? You say there's a much need. You talk about depoliticizing this debate, but isn't it also true that in the solutions that you are talking about, the planning, that it is, there's also a sort of depoliticization going on there, because you, for example, a camp like you talked about, like Zaatari, it is on Jordanian territory, but in fact it is not part of the Jordanian state in any real way, right? It is run by NGOs, etc. You are now working with Paul Romer on also the charter city model. It seems to me that many of these new camps or refugee settlements, or these new cities perhaps, that they are somehow developing outside of the normal mechanisms of states, with their own police and their own, maybe in Europe, their own welfare state models. It seems that they are existing somewhere outside of public policy and somewhere in between NGO and private policy. So what does this do for democratic representation? What does this do for accountability, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And this is so these parallel worlds. I mean, gated communities in a way.
Yes.
Coming
Yes.
up. But that's exactly the point where we say, well, and that's why I'm also, for instance, discussing this in Ethiopia in a couple of weeks ago, and maybe I've been starting this process in 2018 already, and saying, no, this is not about creating a parallel world, but it's actually your lab, your lab as a government to deal with these issues. If it works, you mainstream this. So, I mean, again, when we talk about these zones, the proposed zones in Ethiopia, and again, I will need to feel the temperature, how it's going now, in these not easy times, is certainly to say, well, first of all, the stakeholders involved in this is the municipality itself. So shareholders of that place would be the municipality itself. It would be obviously some form of a developer or investor, and it will be the residents themselves. So it's driven by a common approach. We definitely, at least in what we are sort of proposing, definitely say this is your lab, this is your testing ground, so that then a lot of this, I mean, in form of governance, in form of service provision, one-stop shops, I mean, all these things to facilitate, in fact, the transfer or the transformation of informality into something more formal, yet innovative and different, use that. Because, I mean, the experiences, and this is a big, I know it's a big debate, parallel or not parallel, but if you go through the normal instances, through parliaments, through law changes, I mean, it takes years. We ain't have the time, we don't have the time right now for this. That's as well. So it's in fact a trick to accelerate change. Why are many governments agreeing on industrial development zones as a special zone? Because they know very well that their own regulations, their own laws and so on are so cumbersome, and it's so difficult for anybody to start businesses. That's the way forward. I mean, we're not talking about the sweatshops and exploitation, but we're talking about intelligent zone planning. Many governments have adopted this. So, but why not? Why not for what is one of the keys is your own population, and is to create inclusive spaces which are not gated communities for the rich. Just to say, one of the locations we're looking at outside of Addis Ababa, there's next to it, there's a gated community built by South African investors for people who pay at least $1 million per house. That's not what we're talking about.
So are you it is very much, I think it is also a quote used by Paul Romer or somebody from the Charter City environment, who also said that what in fact you do is you use techniques from this global switchboard of knowledge, techniques perhaps developed in the world of business or the world of entrepreneurship, and you use them for issues of public policy and governance. So you take, but you bypass the normal pathway of democratic representation. Is that true?
Well, I mean, you bypass, let's say, you're not bypassing because you don't make it to a law.
No.
You're basically providing the lab.
Yeah.
It's like your pilot. It's where you can test, where you can, does it work? Would it work? I mean, if you see it as this, it doesn't challenge democracy. I mean, besides that, of course, in our model, and I'm ready to share that with anybody, in our governance model, there is, of course, a representation, there is a participation, it's participatory from bottom up. And again, there's a clear link to the let's say, hosting municipalities, very important. But I mean, the idea is not to create a state in the state. It's not to create a private city. It's not neoliberal in this sense. It's really with the urge to deal with these millions of people, give them some form of legality in a fast track, some form of a lease or a title document which they can then use to be able to establish their businesses and so on and so forth. No, it's by no means meant to challenge the state and the system as such. It is, yes, it is a trick to bypass cumbersome procedures to get things done.
Well, that would be very welcomed. Thank you.
Oh, but it seems that this, well, maybe bypassing, or no, there is. It seems like there's almost full circle between you starting in the Pyrenees and now working in Tunisia, because this village in France was, of course, a kind of bottom-up, do-it-yourself farm and roofing effort, and then you turn to all the large institutions and tested out all those possibilities. But now in Tunisia, you seem to be working on very small-scale bottom-up initiatives. Again, is it back to your roots, or are you sort of balancing the big development plans in Ethiopia?
Well, I mean, here in Tunisia, we also do some bigger migration projects, trying something in one case a bit controversial, in the other one, we're trying to work with migrants themselves, with people who consider to take the boat and go over to Italy or so, trying to have them design their own way forward. I don't like the word empowerment, but sort of encourage them to be more active. That's what we're trying. And we have also, yes, something which resembles very much my village. That's in the south of Tunisia, where we're trying to work with the region of Tatooine. Those who have watched Star Wars will remember Tatooine and some of the stunning images that were made there, where we are working out of an almost abandoned Berber village and the Drogdolit caves, and have actually people express themselves, not us, what they would like to do. And then we're connecting them, that's our switchboard, we're connecting them with expertise, with outside, if needed, expertise. We're bringing them together, and it's a very bottom-up driven co-creation lab approach we are now trying to push forward. As usual, these things have problems to get the finance, so we are appealing to everyone to help getting these things going, because we fall between the cracks. We are a social enterprise without being one officially, because again, the law here is still waiting to be implemented properly. We have difficulties with traditional donor streams, which prefer very much the big institutions, prefer to work with the very, very local associations, but they don't have the mechanisms to deal with them properly. So there is right now, I think, an urgent need to change the whole way of how we have also finances really allow for innovation to take place. I mean, I experience this every day, how difficult it is, especially, of course, in COVID times. But innovation has a hard time. So we will go to crowdfunding, crowdfinancing, whatever to overcome that eventually. But it has been tough, but now it looks more promising, that's for sure.
Yeah, maybe as a last question, a small question. Do you think that within this bottom-up plan that you're working in now with all the do-it-yourself initiatives and the working with local communities, is there a role for architects and planners for the formal disciplines of architecture and planning?
We do work with already a number of architects and architecture universities. We are, I mean, again, in the south of Tunisia, because that's about sustainability, it's about finding the right mix. So we work with emergency architecture for human rights in Copenhagen. We work with TU Dresden, the Technical University of Dresden, and the university here in Tunis. We are inviting people who want to do research, who want to do planning, who would like to do construction in the most stunning environment to work with us. I mean, we do have space. We will have yet another house in the village down there available. We can accommodate groups. We are organizing. We have set up actually now a company which facilitates sustainable alternative tourism, thematic tourism. So you tell us what you need, we can organize it. We can find you the right people to talk with. We facilitate your stay and so on. I mean, that's the platform. As I've told you, the playground which we are offering, and all that primarily driven by the local opportunities.
Sounds absolutely great.
Yeah.
And it also sounds like an invitation that we should take with the independent school visit.
We'd love to come and visit and come and work in the village of Zaatari.
That's the first architect arriving from, he's actually Italian, arriving in a couple of weeks.
Okay, well, we'll be arriving not in a couple of weeks, but we will come.
But we're serious.
Yes, we're serious about it.
So also maybe to say this, we're having a number of students doing their thesis. We have somebody from Maastricht coming out for 4 months doing some work out there on global health. I mean, on health issues linked to ethnographic studies. I mean, we are sort of facilitating this type of in-depth collaboration. We will have, maybe also to mention, we will have a postgraduate international master's in Tunis on sustainable cities and settlements, which is a cooperation primarily between the ESAD University in Tunis, Emergency Architecture for Human Rights, and IPA Switchboard, but also a number of other universities are contributing with lectures and so on. We have UAV, Bologna, and so on and so forth. So we are open for any discussion, for any partnership, and it can range really from augmented reality to architecture, to water systems, to renewable energies, to inviting also some artists.
Well, let's hope that your talk tonight has also inspired lots of people to ring you and come and see what they can contribute.
Yeah, and look at the website of IPA, Innovation Planning Agency.
Yeah.
But I have to warn, it's totally outdated. We lost control of it. We're rebuilding it. So many of the projects on there are totally history. So we'll build something new, but anyway, you will find us. So IPA Switchboard.net, but then we also will have on our facilitation of, as I said, coming to Tunisia, spending time here, working together on this co-creation labs, workshops, and other things.
Wonderful.
Great. I thank you, Kilian.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Great to talk again.
And
we have to
run
because you have to run.
I have to run.
People who don't live in Rotterdam, they have to be at home before 9.
Yeah.
So the curfew has decided for us. The only thing that I would like to mention finally for this Schools Out is we invite you for the next Schools Out, which is also the last Friday, but of next month, of course, 26th of February. And then we'll have a distinguished guest from the United States, an activist and architect who will share her ideas with us. And she's called Pascale Sablon. And it's at the same time, 7 o'clock, 26th of February. See you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Kilian. Thank you all.